On January 15th, 1919, the city of Boston was hit by a tsunami. But it wasn't made of water. It was a 25-foot tall wave of hot, sticky molasses. Yes, the sweet stuff you put on pancakes. A roaring, brown river of syrup crashed through the streets, moving faster than a horse could run. This wasn't a joke. It was a disaster made of candy. So why in the world was there a giant 5-story tall tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses in the middle of a busy city? The reason was a secret. It was for making booze, but not the fun kind. This molasses was used to make industrial alcohol. That alcohol was a key ingredient for making weapons and explosives for World War I. So this whole sweet, sticky story starts with a war. This tank was a disaster waiting to happen. It was famous for being a piece of junk. From the very first day it was built, it leaked. It leaked so badly you could see dark, sticky streaks running down its sides. The company that owned it, Purity Distilling, had a brilliant solution. They just painted the whole tank brown. That way, nobody would notice the constant gooey mess. It was a perfect, terrible plan. Local kids knew all about the leaks. They would bring cups and jars to the base of the tank to collect the sweet drips. It was a free snack. People who worked nearby said the tank would groan and rumble, like a monster getting ready to wake up. So what does it sound like when 2.3 million gallons of syrup finally explode? Witnesses said it started with a deep, strange rumble from the ground. Then, a terrifying sound filled the air. It sounded like a machine gun firing hundreds of bullets. It wasn't a gun. It was the steel rivets holding the tank together, shooting out of the walls like cannonballs. Some of these metal projectiles were found buried deep inside the walls of nearby buildings. Now, this wasn't some slow, lazy river of goo. This was a 35-mile-per-hour battering ram of pure syrup. It hit the neighborhood with unbelievable power. The secret is that molasses is way thicker than water. It's almost 1.5 times as heavy. That extra weight gave the wave a crushing force that nothing could stop. It didn't just flood the streets. It smashed entire buildings completely off their foundations. It twisted a huge, elevated steel train track like it was a cheap toy. It even picked up a whole freight car and tossed it into the harbor. Getting caught was like a nightmare from a scary candy movie. People weren't just hit by the wave, they were trapped in it. The thick brown goo filled their lungs, and they couldn't move. It was a sweet-smelling trap. Rescuers who rushed in to help got stuck themselves. They became part of the sticky problem. One man later said the wave picked him up and swirled him around in total darkness, convinced he was about to die. It was pure chaos. Now picture your entire world suddenly coated in a layer of brown stickiness. That was Boston for weeks. Everything you touched was tacky. Doorknobs, train seats, and even the new payphones were covered in the stuff. People tracked it everywhere. You couldn't walk down the street without your shoes making a horrible squelching sound. It was on the floor of every bus, every shop, every home. Boston had become the world's stickiest city. So how do you clean up millions of gallons of molasses? The fire department had a plan. They decided to just wash it all into the harbor with powerful water hoses. It seemed like a good idea, except it wasn't. They used cold salt water from the harbor. This made the thick molasses even thicker, turning it into a stubborn, gluey mess. For months, the Boston harbor was stained a lovely shade of brown. But here is the most unbelievable part of the whole story. What did the company, United States Industrial Alcohol, say caused the explosion? They blamed anarchists. That's right, anarchists. They tried to convince everyone that a group of Italian anarchists planted a bomb to blow up their giant syrup tank. It was a wild claim with zero proof. It was the biggest, most ridiculous excuse in history. The company basically said, a secret bomb did it, not our leaky, groaning tank. They pointed fingers at a scary-sounding group to hide their own mistakes. Nobody was buying it. This led to one of the wildest court cases in the history of Massachusetts. It was the company's crazy anarchist story versus actual science. For the first time ever, expert witnesses were brought in to explain things to the court. They talked about stuff like thermal expansion and structural fatigue. In simple words, they proved the tank was built cheap. It was a disaster just waiting to happen, and the company knew it. The science was clear. After years of legal battles, the judge finally made a decision. He ruled that the company was 100% at fault. No excuses. This was a huge moment. This single ruling became a landmark case for corporate responsibility in America. It forced companies to be safer. New laws for construction and engineering were created all across the country. And it all happened because of a giant, sticky flood of molasses. But the story doesn't end in the courtroom. For over 50 years after the disaster, something strange happened in Boston. Residents of the North End swore that on the hottest summer days, they could still smell a faint, sweet scent of molasses in the air. The disaster literally became a ghost, haunting the city with its memory. It turned into a spooky local legend, passed down from parents to children. A sweet, sticky reminder of that terrible day hanging in the summer heat. Isn't that just the wildest thing? History isn't always about grand kings and epic battles. It's not just the stuff you read about in thick, boring books. Sometimes, history is about a poorly made tank of pancake topper causing a disaster that changes a nation's laws and becomes a spooky local legend. It proves that the past is full of these weird, unbelievable, and sticky secrets that are just waiting to be uncovered. But the story doesn't end with a verdict or a fading smell. For decades after the flood, the molasses lived on. It had seeped into the ground, into the foundations of buildings, and into the wood of the docks. A sticky ghost that refused to leave. On hot summer days, a faint, sweet smell would still rise from the cobblestones. People living in the North End of Boston would find dark, sticky goo weeping from their basement walls. It was a strange, constant reminder of that bizarre winter day. A local legend you could actually touch. This sweet disaster actually changed America. The company's total failure to build a safe tank was so shocking, it led to new laws. Engineers and architects were now required to show their work. A professional had to sign off on building plans, proving they were safe. Can you believe it? Before this gooey explosion, you could basically build whatever you wanted. It took a 25-foot-tall wave of syrup wiping out a neighborhood for the government to say, hey, maybe we should double-check these things. The Molasses Flood helped create modern building codes. So think about that. Every safety inspection, every construction permit, every time an engineer signs a blueprint, there's a tiny, sticky piece of that Boston disaster in its history. A bizarre tragedy from over 100 years ago is still quietly making our world safer. But let's zoom in on the chaos of that day. Who were the heroes? The very first rescuers were 116 sailors from the USS Nantucket, a ship docked nearby. They heard the crash and didn't even wait for orders. They just ran toward the screams. These sailors charged straight into the brown goo. They waded through the sticky trap, which was waist-deep in some places. The molasses would pull at their boots, trying to suck them under. It was like walking through cold, thick mud that wanted to swallow you whole. These men were trained for combat on the open sea. They were ready for enemy ships and torpedoes. But their enemy that day was a slow, silent, sugary monster. And they fought it, pulling dozens of people from the sticky mess, saving lives one person at a time. And what about the horses? Many of the first victims were the horses that pulled wagons through the city. They were powerful animals, but they were no match for the molasses. They got stuck instantly, their strong legs trapped in the goo. It was a heartbreaking, surreal part of the tragedy. So what's the lesson from a 2-million-gallon dessert explosion? It's that history's biggest disasters aren't always caused by armies or kings. Sometimes, the scariest thing in the world is just a company trying to save a little money and a giant tank full of something you pour on your pancakes.